BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Rooster House by Victoria Belim. Read by Vera Grazia Day. Episode 1. Uncle Vladimir and I fell out a month after his namesake annexed Crimea. Vladimir was my father's older brother. I had lost my father 3 years before, and Vladimir remained the only link to that side of my family. We were born in the same country, Ukraine. We spoke the same language, Russian. I emigrated from Ukraine at the age of 15 to Chicago, and Vladimir at the age of 55 to Tel Aviv. But he remained in his own Soviet galaxy. For me, the Soviet Union was deprivation and empty store shelves, the collapse of the 80s and the disaster of Chernobyl. His Soviet Union was nuclear might and a strong army, the boom of the 50s and the flight of Yuri Gagarin. When the Russian army appeared in Crimea in 2014, I nevertheless assumed that the conflict would never splinter my family's intertwined roots. We spoke Russian at home, except for my maternal great-grandparents Ася and Serhiy, who spoke Ukrainian. I didn't take it as a sign of ethnic difference, because Ася and Serhiy lived in a village, and the rest of us in Kiev. And in the Soviet Union, the cities spoke Russian, and the villages the local languages of the republics. My mother was Ukrainian, my father Russian. None of it mattered within our family. I didn't feel the need to define myself. Now, for the first time in my life, I was expected to take sides. And yet I couldn't pull the Ukrainian or Russian threads out of the tapestry of my identity. I wasn't sure if I wanted to return to Ukraine. My mother had visited every year since we moved to the US. On the rare occasions when I joined her, I felt more foreign in Kiev than I ever did in Chicago. "Leaving is hard, and so is returning," my grandmother Valentina said. I didn't understand what she meant. Like most Soviet children, I grew up with my grandparents' memories of the Second World War. "If only there was no war," was a mantra they repeated. Every other catastrophe could be overcome, they said, but living through war was worse than death. Now the place where I was born, where I grew up, and where my grandmother lived was suffering, and I suffered too. Each new bout of violence convulsing Ukraine reverberated in me. Uncle Vladimir emailed me an article from a Russian nationalist website titled "The Real History of the Ukrainian Famine." The article claimed that the famine of the 1930s was invented by Ukrainian nationalists in Canada and that Ukrainians latched onto the idea to exploit their victimhood. 4 million Ukrainians starved to death between 1932 and 1933, the 2 years that became known as the Holodomor, the Great Famine. My great-grandmother worked as a teacher and watched her students die one by one. Her daily lessons started after she dug graves for the children who had nobody else left to bury them. Crops were confiscated and borders were closed to prevent people from leaving their villages. Ася was 18 then, and the fear of hunger obsessed her for the rest of her life. I sent Vladimir a message saying I didn't understand how he could praise a Soviet Union that destroyed so many lives in our family. He responded with a brief reply. "We must be grateful to the Soviet Union for all the opportunities it gave us. America brainwashed you as surely as American capitalism killed your father." I felt as if I was falling from a great height. After my father's death, Vladimir and I had made a pact that we would talk about my father and what happened when I was ready. Now Vladimir had broken his promise. My father had been absent from my life for years at a time, and our relationship had often been strained. I wasn't ready to examine the causes behind his death. It was too raw and painful. The person I spoke to the most was my grandmother Valentina, because she didn't want to talk about the war. She said that every TV channel and every conversation was filled with it, and she was tired. She talked mostly about the orchard and spring planting. When I asked her if she had a travel passport in case we had to evacuate her out of Ukraine, she told me that she didn't need one. When I insisted, she repeated, enunciating every word, that she didn't want to go anywhere, come what may. Берег, or more properly Krutý Bereg, was our name for a village near the city of Poltava in central Ukraine. None of my mother's family was born here, not even my great-grandparents Asa and Serhiy. Their roots were in the Poltava region, but Bereg was the closest thing to an ancestral home that they had. I was born in Kiev, but the first 15 summers of my life unfolded in this hamlet on the Vorskla River. Bereg was my second home, and Asa and Serhiy were my second set of parents. When I was 8, my parents divorced, and Bereg became my haven. Serhiy was the head teacher of a middle school and a war veteran who had lost his leg during the infamous Battle of Kursk in 1943. In his retirement, he tended to his garden and his great-grandchildren. He had embraced the communist movement while still a teenager and never wavered in his loyalties. By the time I was born, Asa had long retired from teaching and poured her passion into her orchard. She started a business selling flowers and fruit at Poltava's central market. Her cherry orchard fed and clothed us and helped us survive the chaos of the early 90s. Valentina, her daughter, had been a busy, sophisticated career woman when I was a child. Now we talked weekly over the phone, and gardening filled all our recent conversations. "Good, you'll help me in the cherry orchard," she said when I told her that I wanted to come to Ukraine for Orthodox Easter. I decided to stay in Ukraine for 3 weeks. By this time, I had moved with my husband to Belgium. He was worried about me traveling to Ukraine, but he recognized the importance of this journey and supported my choice. As a child, I kept diaries, and I asked my mother to post them to me in Brussels. At the bottom of the box she sent, I found a little blue notebook, and I recognized my great-grandfather Serhiy's hand. At first glance, the journal contained nothing I hadn't heard from Serhiy himself. It was organized by topic: our village of Mayachka, my parents, our farm, our daily life, the First World War, my brothers and sisters. The shortest and the final entry drew my attention. It said, "Brother Nicodim vanished in the 1930s fighting for a free Ukraine." It was underlined. My great-grandfather Serhiy was the youngest of 8 siblings. Oksana died of typhus fever during the Civil War of 1918. Mikita worked for the Tsar's secret police and was killed during the Bolshevik Revolution. Fedir perished on the Eastern Front in 1942. Nestor and Odarka survived 2 world wars. Ivan was born with a short leg, so he avoided the draft and toiled on a collective farm. And then there was Nicodim. In Old Greek, his name meant victory of the people. He vanished. In the spring of 2014, as people were again dying for a free Ukraine, I couldn't stop thinking of this man who disappeared one night in the 1930s. I realized that the absence of Nicodim in our family's stories was striking. What had he done? What happened? My mother's replies were evasive. She said that old fears lingered and that there was one place that embodied them in bricks and mortar. She told me that out loud, my great-grandmother had called it the Rooster House. Under her breath, she called it the Rooster Trap. The Rooster House was in fact the most beautiful building in Poltava. It was an elegant mansion built at the turn of the 20th century to house a bank. 2 voluptuous red sirens, roosters in colloquial speech, flanked its portal. The organization that occupied the Rooster House during Soviet times was first known as the Extraordinary Committee, ЧК, then as the State Political Directorate, GPU, later as the Soviet Security and Secret Police Apparatus, NKVD, and finally it became the Committee for State Security, KGB, by any name, the Secret Police. Poltavans used to joke darkly that the Rooster House was the tallest building in town, because even down in its basement one could see all the way to Siberia. The lower floors served as ЧК torture chambers, and at the height of the Great Terror in 1937-38, people living nearby could hear muffled screams emanating from below the earth. Or so my great-grandmother said. She preferred to take a long detour instead of walking down the elegant boulevard over which the red sirens presided. By the way her right cheek twitched and her voice fell to a whisper, I knew that the Rooster House was a place to avoid. Yet I became obsessed to discover the truth about Nicodim, this uncle who had fought for a free Ukraine and who had paid the highest price. I wanted to restore him to his rightful place in the family story. "Are you sure you want to go now?" my mother worried aloud on the phone. The newspapers were already guessing how many hours it would take for the Russian army to reach Ukraine's capital. But I didn't want to delay my trip. The more I resolved to plunge into an unknown past to find Nicodim, the more my fears about the present faded. The closer I approached to my grandmother's house, the louder the voices on the television grew. I pushed the door, and the lights and sounds rushed toward me. "Babushka, I'm here," I called out. Valentina went to turn the TV off, but instead turned up the volume. She hugged me with all her might, squeezing me as if to ensure that I was real. I wasn't hungry, but Valentina reheated a bowl of borscht. She talked about the garden, the neighbors, and she only mentioned the war once when complaining about rising prices. "I wanted to make roast pork for Easter, but meat costs double what it used to," she said. "Do you mind if we make chicken instead?" In bed that night, wrapped in linen smelling of linden water and dampness, I pressed my cheek against the Turkmen carpet on the wall, its familiar roughness reassuring. "I am back," I said out loud to solidify the idea, and fell asleep.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Rooster House by Victoria Belim. Read by Vera Grazia Day. Episode 2. The mystery of Nicodim's disappearance and subsequent amnesia on the part of my family disturbed me. I waited anxiously for the Easter holidays to end so that I could call the National Archives in Kiev. I had studied the history and politics of the socialist bloc long enough to know that if a person disappeared in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, the most likely culprit was the secret police. I had to find a way into the Rooster House. "How do you expect me to find records of your relative when you have no information about him?" the voice on the other end of the line asked me. "Did it just fall from the sky?" I swallowed my sharp retort and pleaded for help. "Leave us your coordinates and we will call you back," the voice said. Nobody called me. Valentina pretended not to hear my questions about Nicodim and had no interest reliving days long gone. Having given up on the National Archives, I decided to explore Poltava's regional resources for clues to Nicodim's fate. The Regional Archive Bureau projected a grey, faceless mite. It assaulted me with a smell of dust and unfulfilled 5-year plans, and transformed me into yet another number in the line of people. Though line wasn't the right word for the impatient crowd that surged toward the reception desk. "And what do you want?" The receptionist glanced at me and then returned to her computer screen. I explained that I was tracing my family tree and needed the archival information from my great-grandparents' villages. "Девушка, you need to make an appointment with the chief archivist, but she's busy today. Next person in line." Being called a young lady for some reason irritated me even more. "You have no appointment system. I checked your website for instruction," I said, feeling the crowd pressing on my back. "I had no idea anyone used our website," the receptionist said. "I came from another town," I said. "I don't care if you came from Paris, do you understand? Next person in line." I involuntarily pulled back and someone elbowed me out of the way to take my place. I stepped aside and felt another elbow jabbing me in the ribs. The pain infuriated me and I plunged into the crowd, making my way back to the reception desk. "I understand that this is an archives bureau and that your job is to help, not insult your visitors," I said. Once I had made a decision to stand my ground, my anger evaporated and my voice rang out crisp and clear above the suddenly silent crowd. "I live in another country, close to Paris if that matters, and I came here to trace my family history. If I need to make an appointment, I'd like to know how I should do it." The receptionist gawped at me, and so did the people in line. "But why didn't you say from the beginning that you were from abroad?" she murmured. "You need to see Oksana Vasilievna, the chief archivist. Her office is around the corner." I stepped aside and dusted off my coat, feeling as if I had emerged from a brawl. I walked down the hall to the chief archivist's office with the receptionist at my heels. She explained that I was a foreigner looking for my family in Poltava. The chief archivist reached for a voluminous book of records. "Let me check what we might have in our database. Oh, yes, we're so high-tech here." Oksana Vasilievna rolled her eyes and opened a page with a handwritten glossary. I recited the names of the villages where different branches of my Poltava clan originated. Mikhailivka, Mayachka. But Oksana Vasilievna closed the book and put it back on the shelf. "Then I can't help you. None of the archives for these villages survived. They were either burned during the Civil War, destroyed during the Stalinist repressions, or lost after the German occupation. Wiped out." The women spread their hands as if to say that even their mighty bureaucracy was helpless against Ukrainian history. "I also have an uncle who disappeared in the 1930s, I started tentatively. "Do you think that I should make an inquiry at the Rooster House? I mean the Security Service of Ukraine?" The two women smiled at me with motherly pity and shook their heads. "The criminal archives are still classified. Plus, with our situation these days, do you really think that anyone at that organization would help you look for some uncle who disappeared who knows when?" At the bus stop, oblivious to people shoving me, I stood under the metal awning plastered with advertisement for second-hand furniture and farm tools and reflected on my findings. If the archives were wiped out, and if Valentina didn't want to talk about the past, I had to give up my search. I headed down the street where the central paved avenues of Poltava gave way to cobblestones and cherry orchards. I turned right and saw a white building topped with a simple green dome. St. Nicholas Ukrainian Orthodox Church, read a newly minted plaque at the gate. I like stepping inside churches and finding myself enveloped in incense smoke and incantations. I pushed open its heavy wooden doors. The plain white walls of the church were covered with icons of saints, martyrs, and the Virgin Mary. I felt someone watching me and turned around so swiftly that I nearly bumped into a short woman of about 60. She had a round, flushed face and a thick blonde braid wrapped around her head. "Can I take a photo?" I asked. "Sure, go ahead," she replied. "I'm Pani Olga." I wondered if I misheard her. People rarely used pani, an old-fashioned word for lady, in our town of Lenin streets and angled squares. Pani Olga, meanwhile, was eyeing my camera. "I have an archive that needs to be photographed," she said without any preamble. "Would you be able to come once or twice a week and take photos?" She noticed my hesitation and added, "I will pray for you." I said yes, without fully understanding what I had agreed to do. So that spring, I still helped Valentina in the orchard, but on the weekends, I took a bus to Poltava and photographed Pani Olga's archive. What Pani Olga called the archive was a bundle of cloths, the most precious among them being the rushniki. At first glance, a rushnik looks like a fancy hand towel with 2 thick bands of embroideries. But as Pani Olga explained, a rushnik holds a newborn baby. It binds newlyweds to symbolize an unending union. The size of a rushnik depends on its function. The longest rushnik is that one that lowers the coffin into the ground. I told Pani Olga about my search for Nicodim. "You are too impatient," she said. "Give your grandmother time. Meanwhile, why not visit villages where your grandparents lived and see what you can find? Talk to people. Breathe the air." Pani Olga had a point. Several days later, she and I made plans to travel by marsrutka, a type of shared taxi, to the neighboring town of Reshetilivka. Pani Olga wanted to visit the Reshetilivka Rushnik Museum and date a number of embroidery patterns that baffled her. I, on the other hand, was on a quest of my own. Before World War II, Asa worked briefly as a teacher at the school attached to the Clara Zetkin carpet factory in the town. Even if the trip would bring me no closer to Nicodim, it could help me find more information about my great-grandmother. When we arrived at Reshetilivka, I found a town like other small Ukrainian towns, with its mix of neat brick houses, apartment blocks with ugly tiled facades, Soviet-era war memorials, and patches of kitchen gardens. Pani Olga explained that the Reshetilivka masters created many original techniques in embroidery, weaving, carpet making, wood carving, and painting. A woman at the bakery in the town center laughed when I asked for direction to the Clara Zetkin factory. "You're 20 years too late, sweetheart. Zetkin was finished off in the 1990s. Pani Olga didn't seem to consider the demise of the factory to be bad news for our quest, and after thanking the woman, she bought a packet of peanut cookies. Stepping out of the sweet fumes of the bakery, she steered me toward the low barracks in the distance. "Nothing disappears completely," she said. The barracks turned out to be the Reshetilivka Arts College, and as soon as we entered the dark hallway smelling of dust and paint thinner, I knew we were inside a Soviet-era institution. The college had bicolored walls, dirty brown at the bottom and dirty white on top, in the manner that might have been prescribed by the government standards circa 1980. A plump woman with a handsome dimpled face and dark brown hair introduced herself as Nadia Vakulenko, the embroidery teacher. Nadia invited us to have tea in the staff room. We squeezed into the cramped space and offered the teachers our peanut cookies. When Pani Olga explained that we came all the way from Poltava to take a look at the local embroideries, Nadia grew excited. She offered to take us to the Rushnik Museum herself. Despite being a small-budget affair, the Rushnik Museum displayed an investment of much love and care. The Rushniki on display were decorated in a variety of styles, from white lacy motifs to sumptuous red and blue ornaments. Nadia unfolded a white linen shirt, decorated in the famous filigree white and white Reshetilivka embroidery style. The garment felt as light as butterfly wings in my hands. A collection of photographs from the Glara Zetkin factory caught my attention. I looked for Ася in the hazy sepia prints, even though it was unlikely that as a school teacher she would have been photographed along with the weavers. In one image, a group of women dressed in ornate embroidered dresses worked on a rushnik with a tree of life motif. Underneath it hung another image with the serene, solitary mood of a Vermeer painting. It showed a woman standing in front of an open window. She wore a headscarf and she leaned over a pile of rushniki with a determined concentration. It could have depicted Asa. Enraptured, I stared at the photograph until Pani Olga tapped me on the shoulder. We missed our bus back to Poltava and had to hitchhike. As we stood by the side of the road, the bells of the freshly painted mint-green church sounded the evening prayers. An armored convoy rolled slowly past us. The soldiers' faces were ashen and dusty, and they sat in silence, staring into the distance. At that moment, I thought of the white on white embroideries. Perhaps I was searching for evidence that beauty and art can survive the worst turmoil of history. I held on to this idea as the convoy rolled on, interminable. That night, I dreamed of tangled threads and white embroideries.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
The Rooster House by Victoria Belim. Read by Vera Grazia-Day. Episode 3. On the wall of the dining room in my great-grandparents' house, there hung a reproduction of an old map. This is the first map of Ukraine, my great-grandfather Sergei had told me. The map was drawn by Guillaume Levasseur de Beauplan, a French military engineer in the army of the Crown of the Kingdom of Poland. His map of Ukraine is famous for its astonishing level of detail about towns, borders, and landscapes. I remembered that in his tiny diary, Sergei had written, "Our native village of Mayachka in the Poltava Governorate was a Cossack settlement, and that's why we supported the Bolshevik Revolution." "Babushka, I would like to go to Mayachka," I told Valentina later that day. "Why do you want to go there?" she asked. "I'm curious to see where Sergei grew up. He often mentioned the Cossack heritage of Mayachka and talked about Beauplan's map." Valentina didn't let me finish my sentence. "But we have potatoes to plant," she exclaimed. We had already planted potatoes, and my first experience was so grueling that I wasn't eager to repeat it. "Do you know anyone in Mayachka, by the way?" I asked her after a pause. "No, I don't know anybody in Mayachka," Valentina said. She got up from the table and stomped off to the corridor to check on seed potatoes sprouting white roots. The following day, I set off alone by bus from Poltava. When I saw a sign for Mayachka appear on the road, I jumped out of my seat and asked the bus driver to pull over. "The village is straight ahead," he said. He pressed on the accelerator and sped off in a cloud of dust. I walked slightly off the main road until I came across a row of gravestones. The old tombs stood adorned with Carinian crosses. while the newer ones had stone tablets with pictures of the deceased. And then I came face to face with Sergei. He stared at me from a black and white porcelain photograph set into a block of granite. The piercing, deep-set eyes and the mane of white hair. Ivan Pavlovich Beresko, I read on the tombstone, and recognized Sergei's older brother, the one who survived the wars and spent his life in Mayachka. I crossed the cemetery looking for graves of Sergei's parents or other siblings, but Ivan's tomb was the only one bearing the name of Beresko. After 2 hours of fruitless searching, I gave up and headed toward the village. A group of grandmothers in triangular headscarves sat on a bench under a mulberry tree. Before I had a chance to address them, they asked in unison where I was going. I explained that my great-grandfather was born in Mayachka and that it was the first time I was visiting his native village. The women whipped out cell phones from the pockets of their black aprons. After a volley of calls around the village, they told me that I should find one Konstantin Telatnik, who was friends with the Beresko family. "Follow this road, and when you see a dark blue house, enter and tell them that Tonya sent you," one of the grandmothers told me. Their readiness to help reminded me why I enjoyed being in Ukraine. A 30-something woman didn't appear surprised at either my visit or my explanation. "Grandpa's starting to forget things," she said, showing me into Konstantin Telatnik's room. A bald old man was reclining under the bed covers. He had powerful arms covered with tattoos, and his fingers fidgeted over the quilted blanket. "This young lady wants to ask you a question about the Beresko family," the granddaughter said loudly. Konstantin fixed his watery eyes on me. I asked him if he knew whether any Bereskos still lived in Mayachka. "Mayachka was such a beautiful place," he began. "The real river, forest, fishing. Of course I remember the Beresko boys. I remember fishing with Sergei," he said. "Or maybe Ivan." I held my breath, but Konstantin's eyes dimmed, and he started coughing and shaking so violently that I could do nothing but apologize for my intrusion and leave. Whenever I saw passerby, I stopped them to ask if they had heard of the Beresko family, but it seemed that I followed a trail of vanishing stories. "Grandmother would have known this, but she passed away last week." "If only you came earlier when the older folks were still alive," people said, sighing. It seemed fitting that Sergei's village still had a statue of Lenin in its main square. I followed the direction of his glance and discovered the village council office. The head of the village council, Taisia, was a heavy-set woman in her 60s with brusque manners and delicately manicured hands. As she listened to me, she screwed up her eyes and nodded. Then she picked up the rotary dial phone and in a loud voice asked for the collective farm records to be brought into her office. "Yes, I mean all of the collective farm records that we have," she said. The woman on the other end of the line sounded dismayed enough for me to hear her high-pitched indignation. "All means all," Taisia repeated and put down the receiver. A moment later, a young woman appeared bearing a tower of folders. She shot me a withering glance, but Taisia motioned for her to leave and closed the door. "I know Ivan Beresko's daughter-in-law. She still lives in Mayachka, and perhaps she might be able to tell you something about the family," Taisia said. "But if you're undertaking a proper research, first you should examine the collective farm records. They mention things like the names of the head of the household and family members, their dates of birth, their occupations, their level of education, and sometimes even a new address if they moved out of the village. I will help you." Taisia put on her glasses. "This stack is mine, and that one is yours." It took us more than 2 hours to find the first mention of Sergei's brothers Fedor, Nestor, and Ivan. The collective farm records confirmed that Fedor didn't survive the Second World War and had neither wife nor children. Nestor and Ivan lived side by side, but while Nestor's children left Mayachka, Ivan and his family stayed. The plot on which they grew wheat, rye and barley lay on the edge of Mayachka. "I found a record on someone called Fekla Beresko," Taisia said. "Not sure if it's relevant." I looked over her shoulder at the spot she was marking with her painted pink nail. "Fekla Zaharovna Beresko, Vera Nikodimovna Beresko, Nikolai Nikodimovich Beresko. There is a note next to Fekla Beresko. Nikodim Beresko, husband, born in 1900. I could hear my heartbeat reverberating in my ears. Nikodim. The collective farm records showed that Fekla came to Mayachka in 1938 with only her son and daughter. It meant that Nikodim must have already vanished by then. She worked on a small plot of land and was listed as a housewife. During the Second World War, her daughter Vera was taken as an Ostarbeiter, a slave worker, to Germany, and was listed as missing. The records were silent on the fate of Fekla and Nikolai after 1945, but I already had more information than I had hoped to find coming to Mayachka. Taisia wrote down the address of Lyuba Porfirivna, Ivan Bereska's daughter-in-law, on a piece of paper, walked with me into the main square, and pointed to the big road behind the village. Apricot orchards and old-fashioned wells punctuated the landscape, and green wheat fields lined the road. "Look for a crooked apple tree and a thatched roof henhouse," were Taisia's instructions. Before long, I spotted a small whitewashed house. I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I sat down on a bench under the apple tree, stretched out my tired legs, and fell asleep. I opened my eyes with a start to find a short old woman with a round face, blue eyes, and wispy white hair shaking me by the shoulder. Her mouth fell open in surprise to reveal one golden tooth. "Why are you sleeping under my apple tree?" she asked me. I said that I was her relative, and she looked panicked. When I explained how I thought we were related, the woman shook her head. "We aren't real relatives then. I was married to Arkady Sayanka, Ivan's stepson." She sounded relieved. She introduced herself as Lyuba Porfirivna and invited me to have a cup of tea. Her house was a traditional Ukrainian hut, large and spacious. I saw the remnants of a wood-burning stove and a svalok, a massive beam that supported the roof. The sun was setting and a burnt orange glow spread over the wheat field in front of her house. "I can't let you roam the country roads this late," she said. "Heaven forbid something happens to you, and then I won't be able to forgive myself." She pointed to a narrow cot near the tile inlay stove. "You don't mind sleeping there, do you?" I accepted Lyuba Porfirivna's offer and called Valentina to tell her that I would stay overnight at the village. I helped make dinner. We ate at a small table under a grape arbor, skewering potatoes from the pot with our forks and mashing them into pork fat. Lyuba Porfirivna glanced at me from time to time with a maternal concern. "How did you end up here in Mayachka?" she asked me. I said that I was looking for Nikodim, Sergei and Ivan's brother. Lyuba Porfirivna was silent for a moment and chewed slowly. "He put a whole family in danger," she said. "He was arrested. It was something political." "But what did he do?" Lyuba Porfirivna looked at me helplessly. "It was so long ago, and my memory is fading. Ivan said that he was bound to ruin the whole family." When we were washing the dishes later, Lyuba Porfirivna mumbled something under her breath and then said, "They came and took him away." "Who they?" "They, them," she repeated. She put her face into her hands and started crying. I hugged her, feeling the sharp bones of her body under her house dress, and wiped away her tears. We bolted the door and turned off the light. Lyuba Porfirivna murmured and sighed in her sleep. I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Who was taken away? Nicodim? His stepson Arkady? Someone else? I woke up the next morning as dawn was breaking. Cool air smelling of crushed grass, fresh cream, and cow dung entered the room. Lyuba Porfirivna's bed was already made, and on the dining table stood a jar of milk and a basket of eggs. I found my hostess outside, feeding chickens. "Last night I made a mistake," she said. "Ivan wasn't talking about Nicodim when he said that he was going to ruin the whole family. He was talking about his younger brother Sergei." I looked at her stupefied. What was Sergei, the serious and responsible brother, planning to do that could have harmed the whole family? But Lyuba Porfirivna began to sweep the yard. She didn't know anything else, or perhaps she didn't want to talk about it. On the bus back to Bereg, the countryside ran past the window as a patchwork of wheat and rye fields in green and yellow. I thought that with each piece of the puzzle solved, another great mystery revealed itself.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
The Rooster House by Victoria Belim. Read by Vera Grazia Day. Episode 4. As I stepped off the train in Poltava in 2015, the familiar sense of pungent greenery, scorched rubber, and poppy seed rolls made me lightheaded. On reaching Bereg and hugging my grandmother, I followed my own version of a homecoming ritual and went into the garden to touch the rough bark of the cherry trees. The war in the east still rumbled on, but the acute fear gave way to anxiety about rising prices and a collapsing economy. Valentina stopped watching Turkish soap operas and spent hours glued to the television following debates about gas subsidies. Her pension had lost 3/4 of its value since the previous year, and whatever remained was barely enough to cover the heating bill. Valentina once again had ambitious plans for the garden, but this time she delegated the main duties to Uncle Toля, a short, wizened man on the other side of his 80s. Uncle Toля always wore a grey suit complete with a double-breasted jacket and peach-colored shirt. The suit and its threadbare chic, like Uncle Toля himself, belonged to another era. "The end is coming," Uncle Toля would announce in place of a greeting. "We might as well plant those cherry trees today." Uncle Tola's main occupation was digging graves in the cemetery, and his work around death gave him a philosophical attitude to life. After work, Uncle Toля washed his face and hands at a water pump, shook out his jacket, and with obvious enjoyment partook of Valentina's cooking. She filled the table with food, apologizing for the meager quantity and the poor taste of the delicacies she prepared, while he refused 3 times, before agreeing with a faint reluctance to taste only a couple of morsels. He and Valentina then went through another complex ritual of her giving him money for the work and him refusing it. In the end, he took what she'd offered, ate enough for 3 people, bid a formal goodbye, and then stayed chatting with Valentina for the rest of the afternoon. I took a bus to Reshetilivka. I remembered the embroiderers I met during my first visit and decided to drop in on them again. When I entered the classroom at the Arts College, the teacher Nadia Vakulenko recognized me and jumped up. "I was hoping you'd return. Would you like some tea?" As the kettle in the staff room hissed and sputtered, the other teachers joined us. During a lull in the conversation, I reminded Nadia that my great-grandmother lived in Reshetilivka briefly before the Second World War and wondered if the town's archives might not have some information about my family. Alla, an embroidery teacher, turned to the drawing instructor to her right. "Vita, don't you know the woman who works at the archives? Take the girl there and ask them to do some digging in the system." Vita agreed, and as soon as we finished our tea, we went across the street to the archives center. It was lunch hour, and Vita's friend Rosa was eating a sandwich at her desk. Vita explained that I was a foreigner looking for her relatives in Ukraine. I gave her Asia's full name, and Rosa typed it into the search window and pressed a button. Up came the words in red block letters, "Record not found." I gave Sergei's name, but once again the computer beeped and displayed, "Record not found." Then I remembered finding Asia's old letters, which she signed as Vasilina. "Would you please try another name?" I asked. "Perhaps the old records exist under that name." The page went grey, and a small hourglass icon swirled as the machine hummed. "I've got it!" Rosa exclaimed. She could see the record with its string of dates and numbers leading to other members of the family. I asked Rosa to search for Nicodim Beresco and explained what happened to him in the 1930s. "Why don't you check with the Security Service of Ukraine, the organization that had inherited the KGB archive after the fall of the USSR?" Rosa asked. "Mind you," she said, "it always gives me the creeps to walk past that horrid Rooster House." My great-grandmother had such an intense fear of the Rooster House that we always took a detour to avoid it. She called it the Rooster Trap, I said. "My great-grandmother, Ina's friend, was arrested, but she was released after a couple of days. Her hair turned grey overnight. Maybe Vasilina was arrested too?" I was dumbstruck. It didn't seem probable that Asa could have been arrested. And yet what else, if not a glimpse inside the Rooster House, could explain her paranoid fear of the place, down to the mere mention of its name? When I reached the bus station back in Poltava, I hailed a taxi and said, "To the Rooster House." The door of the Poltava headquarters of the SBU looked heavy, but it swung open with such ease that I nearly lost my balance and tumbled inside. 2 men in grey suits and several soldiers stood in the hall, and the moment I entered, they turned around and looked at me. What should I do if I'm looking for someone who disappeared in the 1930s? The officer took out a pad and wrote down an address. "We have an archive division," he said, handing me a piece of paper. "It's 5 minutes walk from here. It's called the Sectoral State Archive of the Security Service of Ukraine." He checked his wristwatch and confirmed that the archives should be open. I spent 2 hours circling the neighborhood. At last, I came upon the archival division hidden under the stone arches of a dark passage. The sign said that it was closed. Walking by the Rooster House on my way back to the bus station, I noticed the officer who had directed me to the archives. He asked me if I had found them, and I explained that the office had already closed. "We can call Yelena Ivanovna, the officer in charge of our archives, on the internal line," he said. He dialed the number and handed me the phone. The female voice on the other end of the line sounded as if it belonged to someone who had no patience for small talk. "Most of the former KGB archives are still classified, so first I need to interview you." In contrast to its grim surroundings, the archive division inside the municipal jail had the atmosphere of a typical administrative office, prosaic and dull. A tall, dark-haired woman in a grey trouser suit shook my hand and offered me a chair. "Why do you want to find this Nicodim?" That summer day, in the middle of the Russia-Ukraine war, how could I convey to a former KGB archivist that I was looking for an uncle missing for almost a century because I wanted to make sense of the present and to understand my roots? "Did you have any other people in the family who were arrested?" Yelena Ivanovna asked. I remembered my suspicions that Ася might have had her brush with the Rooster House, which is why she feared it. Vasilina Alexina Beresko, I said, and added hastily, but it's only a guess. She nodded. I will check through our archives, but I need at least this Nikodim's date of birth or date of his arrest. I left feeling more desperate. The closer I came to solving the mystery, the more it eluded me. Was Ася ever arrested? I asked Valentina that evening. Her face flushed crimson, and the knuckles of her hands whitened around the teacup she was holding. She placed the cup carefully onto the saucer. As you know, my mother worked at the school in Zhirkovka during the Nazi occupation, and as a result, she was called in for questioning by the NKVD. She walked over to the armoire, where she kept old porcelain wrapped in newspapers and stacks of yellowing linens. She pulled out a beige paper folder and handed it to me. Ася was never charged, but she was certain that her dossier was under close surveillance by the KGB. The dossier in front of me was simply a dossier with work information and personal details, but it could have been used to make a case. Ася could emerge as either innocent or condemned, and she wouldn't be able to do anything about it. No wonder she lived in fear of the rooster trap. I was about to close the file when I saw a narrow strip of paper with handwriting in dark purple ink sewn into the binding. I had to pry apart the edges of the folder to read the sentence. Arrested family members. Nikodim Pavlovich Beresko, brother-in-law, year of arrest, 1937. Valentina walked into the room as I was reading the file. I showed her the strip. So you found Nikodim, she said. She sat down and clasped my hand. I was wrong to forbid you to search for Nikodim, she said. It was a selfish thing to do, and I'm sorry. Serhiy wanted to search for his brother, but Ася forbade him to do anything. His older brother Ivan was also worried that such an inquiry might bring harm to the whole family. In the end, their fear of the Rooster House silenced him. We never talked about Nikodim anymore. We preferred to forget. She reached out and stroked my cheek. Serhiy would have wanted you to find Nikodim. I took her hand and pressed it to my face, feeling its roughness and warmth. Once again, the prison gate shut behind me with a heavy bang. Yelena Ivanovna closed the cabinet and turned to face me. She was holding a file. Its green cover was marked with smudged ink stamps and lines of scribbled writing. Case number 1056846, declassified. It was easier to find than I expected, but I would like to warn you before you read it, Yelena Ivanovna said, holding the file firmly. It was 1937, the headquarters to fulfill. Read between the lines. She put the file in front of me and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind her. I touched its stained cover. The name on the folder read, Nikodim Pavlovich Beresko. I counted to 3 and opened the file. The first page included transcripts of the interrogations, written presumably by the police superintendent at the time and initialed by Nikodim. The language of the transcript and the familiar phrases that I had often heard at school, counter-revolutionary conspiracy, agitator of the population, anti-Soviet views, made the file seem like a cliched plot rather than a narrative from which to glean truth. I noticed that some parts of the file were crossed out and rewritten in another hand. The Trotskyist conspiracy Nikodim had allegedly joined now became a bourgeois nationalist organization aiming to establish an independent Ukraine. Nikodim's case had to be made to fit the new storyline. Nikodim signed the confession. However, his case never went to trial. because he died by suicide after one of the interrogations. Hanged himself from a piece of lining he had torn out of his jacket, or so the file said.
BBC Sounds, music, radio, podcasts.
The Rooster House by Victoria Belim. Read by Vera Grazia Day. Episode 5. I reached the end of the documents in the main file, but the folder contained more pages. One of them was a letter on unlined paper written in 1955 from Nicodem's wife, Thekla. My husband, Nicodem Beresco, was taken away on August 24th, 1937, by the constables of the Poltava region, for reasons unknown. I plead with you to tell me why he was taken away and what happened to him. Thekla's poignant letter reminded me why I had started my quest for Nicodem in the first place. I wanted to pay tribute to a relative who had been reduced to a crossed-out name in the archives. I wanted to commemorate his life. I wanted his tragedy to be acknowledged. There were more pages at the end of the file. In 1993, Nicodem's son Nikolai Beresco, by now a 59-year-old man approaching retirement age, wrote to the Security Service of the newly independent Ukraine, the USBU as it was then known, explaining that he needed a certificate of Nicodem Beresco's rehabilitation as he was applying for pension benefits. Nikolai was notified that the certificate of rehabilitation was given to Thekla Beresco, Nicodem's wife, in 1962. Unfortunately, this is all we know about the tragic fate of your father, a victim of the Stalinist repression, the letter concluded. In 1995, Nikolai sent another letter begging the authorities to send him the certificate of rehabilitation. The next reply to Nikolai explained that since his family should have received the certificate of rehabilitation, he needed not the certificate of rehabilitation, but a duplicate of the certificate of rehabilitation, a completely different document necessitating an inquiry at the public prosecutor's office of the Poltava region. Nikolai followed this Kafkaesque trail and wrote letters to the public prosecutor and the assorted public prosecutor office divisions in Poltava. He wrote to the civil registration offices. He wrote again to the USBU, which by then had become the SBU. He included copies of all correspondence, but was sent deeper into the morass of bureaucracy. I beg you, gentlemen, help me, he wrote in his last letter. I can't receive my pension benefits without this form. I handed the file on Nicodem Beresco to the officer in charge of the KGB archives and rushed out of the prison to find myself back in the bright summer day of Poltava. I needed to breathe deeply and leave behind the darkness that clung to me. I had photographed the file with permission of the officer, and several days later, Valentina and I read it together. My grandmother rubbed her face as if trying to shake herself out of a daze, and said, "All this time you were searching for Nicodem, I kept hoping that you would find nothing and give up. I underestimated how important it was to know the truth, whatever the truth might be." She went to bed early, leaving me alone with Nicodem's file. He left no note. A line in blue ink appeared under the prison warden's report detailing Nicodem's suicide. He left no note. Neither did my father. When my stepmother had rung me some years before to tell me that my father had shot himself, she told me he left no note. He left without explaining anything. It was his biggest betrayal, and I couldn't forgive him. Nicodem's departure left a black hole, just as my father's had. I needed to speak with my uncle Vladimir, my father's brother. I called him in Tel Aviv. I explained how I uncovered the mysterious disappearance of Nicodim and how that search was important for me to understand my roots and my relationship to my family and even to Ukraine itself. I told Vladimir about Nicodim's tragic end. Then I hesitated for a moment. I made up my mind. I'm ready. I want to ask you about Dad. Did he kill himself or was he killed? As I formed the words, I thought of Nicodim's file and the same question I had reading the note about his suicide. Was he pushed to suicide? He was goaded into a bankrupting scheme. He might as well have been killed. American capitalism killed your father. We were both silent. He was roped into a project to build affordable green energy housing, Vladimir continued. He, who knew nothing about construction, but imagined himself as the next great real estate developer. He wouldn't listen to me. He invested money. He borrowed more than he could afford. And the banks were eager to give him money, knowing fully well that he was heading for disaster. The whole system was set up to take advantage of gullible people like your father. And he failed. It didn't take long for the project to reveal itself as a mirage. But he kept hoping. He kept going to the banks. He kept knocking on doors. He was a loser. Nobody in America likes a loser. And then it all collapsed. And I was too far away. Vladimir's voice frayed into sobs. Although I knew some of the details of my father's unsuccessful business venture from speaking to his friends in California, hearing the story from Vladimir was still searing. But I recognized now that though some pain never goes away, I could learn to embrace the past in its complexity. I gave myself the freedom to grieve. I was back with Valentina in September. In the morning, I took a rake and swept the fallen leaves. Some days I could smell winter in the air, and it made me anxious. The cycle of decay and rebirth was unrelenting, and to keep melancholy thoughts at bay, I reminded myself that I was preparing the garden for spring. I heard my name called. My grandmother was leaning over the garden gate. She was pointing at my cell phone and holding it away from her as if it carried a contagious disease. "Organe," she mouthed. It meant the organs, the popular name for the KGB. I wiped my dirty hands on the burdock leaves and hurried over to Valentina. "This is Yelena Ivanovna, the SBU Archives Director. I was going through some of my paperwork, and this is in regards to your visit to examine the file of Nicodim Beresco. Do you have a minute?" I recognized the voice of the archivist from the Rooster House. I didn't have Valentina's dread of the organization, but receiving a call in such an unexpected fashion put me on edge. "Yes, Yelena Ivanovna, I'm listening." I sat down on a bench under the lilac shrub and waved to Valentina to go inside. Uncertain, she lingered behind the wooden fence and then walked slowly toward the house. "The file on my great-uncle says he died by suicide," I began. Yelena Ivanovna didn't let me continue. "Nicodim Beresco didn't die by suicide," she said. "He was shot along with thousands of other people. In 1937, the KGB killed people to fill their quotas and later made up their cases to give the impression that they had followed due process to the letter. They also issued fake death certificates for suicides or heart disease to absolve the state of any responsibility. Beresco's death notice doesn't look right. The original has no date, no time, no signature, apart from whatever was written later in a different hand and different ink." Yelena Ivanovna paused and then said, The people who wrote these documents were themselves shot. The chief interrogator was accused of being the mastermind behind the same Trotskyist organization that was the pretext for Beresko's execution. I was silent. I was tracing the veins of a yellow leaf that landed in my lap. Of course, we don't know for sure what happened. We will never know for sure. We can only see the patterns, Elena Ivanovna said. But your uncle was innocent. If Nicodim was innocent, why did you not issue the bloody rehabilitation notice to his son instead of making him write dozens of letters and lose out on his pension? I asked, interrupting her. I can't apologize for the entire organization, but I'm sorry. I'm genuinely very sorry, Elena Ivanovna said calmly. Even those of us working in the Rooster House have a conscience and our own fears, she added. I stumbled into the house. Valentina sat at the dining room table, holding the newspaper. She glanced at me with concern. Your cheeks are burning. Are you sure you haven't caught a chill? She touched my forehead. Anyway, what did the KGB want? Whoever occupied the Rooster House remained as the KGB to Valentina. I replied that the archivist called to tell me that Nicodim didn't commit suicide, and that his death was senseless and tragic. You and I always knew this, did we not? She said gently. What is the truth in the story? I asked. Valentina removed her reading glasses, pushed them away from her impatiently, and switched on the morning news. It depends on what you mean by the truth, she said. You were looking for Nicodim, but you were really looking for the explanation behind your father's... She didn't say suicide. She cut herself off, turned to the TV, and increased the volume. And I think that if that's your truth, then you found it. The last time I saw my grandmother was in the final months of 2019. We prepared the orchard for the winter and planned the planting for next spring. In late 2021, she fell ill with COVID. The last time we talked on Skype, she breathed with difficulty but dismissed her illness. I dried a tray of apples for you, she said. The next day, she was taken to hospital, where she passed away in her sleep at the age of 87. On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and started a war that at the time of writing is still ongoing. Losing Valentina made all of us feel that nothing could ever be the same. But my cousin Dmitro stayed in Bereg because he wanted to continue tending our grandmother's garden. Now I understand why Ася and Sergei grew their cherry orchard and how they survived the many calamities of the 20th century in the borderlands. The orchard still stands, full of sunlight and birdsong, its bounty a refusal to submit to despair and fear. Every bud and every branch illuminates the darkest of days with hope. We carry on living, and we tend to our garden one day at a time, one tree at a time.